morning, everyone. Thank you, the Lusk Center, for having me here today. It's a great honor. This is a joint work with Jung Hyun Choi from Urban Institute. And actually, we think it's a great time to present this paper at this moment because after running a series of regressions, we've find some different but interesting stories from the previous literature, and we've got various explanations for our findings. So we'd appreciate your comments and questions to help us better shape the direction of this paper in the future step. But before I cut to the chase, I find the audience today is a great sample to conduct a survey, and I have several survey questions in head. I think the group today is a great sample because we are all interested and know something about the housing market. And we are, to some extent, a bit more rational than average people in making decisions. So question one, suppose...
Wait a second, we all chose to be academics.
Is that rational? So question one, suppose now we're all homeowners. We're surfing on Zillow, and you realize the price of your house property increased by 10% from last year. So my question is, will it increase your consumption based on this increase in your house prices? Raise your hands if you choose yes. Okay. Or raise your hands if you say no. Okay, perfect. Why no? Okay, let me ask another question. In the process of making the decision, would you take a minute to try to identify whether this 10% a permanent or transitory shock? Is that a factor in making the decision? Raise your hand if yes. Perfect. Okay, I think I can jump to my conclusion slides and finish the presentation in 2 minutes, and then we can have an extra 40 minutes coffee break. But actually, this question puzzles me a lot because it relates to our daily life. For most of the households, housing wealth accounts for the greatest share of their assets. And also, if we take the aggregate level data, the personal consumption data also accounts for more than 2/3 of the growth of the GDP in the United States. So what is the relationship between the changes in housing wealth and the changes in household consumption is really important in terms of policy making. And if we pull out the data of US housing data and personal consumption expenditures, it's not very hard to see these synchronized movements between house price appreciation rates and also personal consumption expenditure growth rates. And actually, a great array of literature has delved into examining the relationship between the two variables. Basically, there are 3 hypotheses. So hypothesis 1, when house price increases, your perceived housing wealth increases too, and that stimulates your consumption behaviors. But you all answered no to this channel just now. Hypothesis 2, when your house price increases, you tend to borrow against the increasing home equity to fuel your consumption, which means there is a collateral channel here functioning, underlying the two variables or to form these synchronized movements. Hypothesis 3 is there's actually no causal relationship between the two. It is actually the common factors such as the factors impact on your permanent income expectations that drives both your house price and also your consumption behaviors. If we look at the previous literature, surprisingly, the empirical findings support the hypothesis 1 and 2. The significance and magnitude of the marginal propensity to consume, we call it MPC here, range between 0.04 to 0.09, meaning that a 1% increase in house prices, or net housing wealth, is correlated with 0.04% to 0.09% increase in household consumption or consumption in aggregate level. Also, previous literature finds there's heterogeneity in MPCs. Households with credit constraints, higher indebtedness, and residing in low-income regions have greater sensitivity to shocks in housing wealth. However, if we go back to the theories, we don't see a solid theoretical underpinnings for H1 and H2. Actually, what theories provide us is actually the housing wealth effect should be really trivial. So if we go back to the theory first, and under the fully self-insurance assumption, we can see that both life cycle hypothesis or permanent income hypothesis predict very small housing wealth effect. Actually, so the beta here should go to 0 because theories predict only permanent changes in income or wealth can have the impact on household consumptions, and they treat the changes in property as transitory shocks. But now in reality, not every households are fully self-insured. If you relax the assumption on that, and now households are facing uninsurable risk, then here comes the buffer stock hypothesis based on the findings that consumption is actually concave in wealth. So under the buffer stock hypothesis, there is an equilibrium or target wealth to permanent income ratio. Here we call it A star. And this ratio is important because it balances the trade-off between your precautionary saving motive and your impatience to consume. Suppose that status quo, your wealth to permanent income ratio is smaller than the target ratio, then your precautionary saving motive will dominate. And even when you experience positive wealth shocks, you will tend to save more until you reach the equilibrium point. However, here under these circumstances, when the magnitude of the wealth shock is large enough, that shifts the relationship between your status quo ratio and your target ratio. In other words, now your current A is greater than the A star. And here you may have a channel to consume more until the ratio goes back to the equilibrium. But here, theories predict as a differential impact between financial wealth and housing wealth, because here housing wealth is different in terms that it is both, housing is both a consumption good but also an investment good. And it's, in terms of liquidity, it's really hard to realize your capital gains unless you sell it, which does not belong to the discussion of this paper, or you choose to borrow against your increasing home equity to fuel your consumption. So in terms of the pure wealth effect, which is the hypothesis 1, there's no solid theoretical underpinnings to predict that people will actually act out of their perceived housing wealth. So the motivation of this paper is actually the gap between theory and empirics. The research question here is, after directly control for the cholera channel, is there a significant perceived housing wealth effect? If the answer is yes, then what's the magnitude of the impact? Has the MPC been overestimated by the previous literature, which is between 0.04 to 0.09? And if yes, which categories of consumption are more sensitive to shocks in wealth? Here we decompose the consumption into several subcategories: housing, food, cloth, education, transportation, health, and recreation. And if the answer to that question is no, then that's the end of the story. I find myself in pain while researching on these questions. So I always try to convince myself this is a really important question to justify my pain. Because there is a great array of literature has already examined this question. So it's, to answer this question is not enough to say, okay, it's an important question. It's also important to think, is it a dead topic already? Because it's a well-established field. Is there still a research frontier out there that we can make a contribution? That the contribution is both important and new. And to answer that question, we need to first summarize the existing empirical challenges in this field. So from me and my co-authors' perspective, there are still 5 unsolved empirical challenges in this question. First, households' unobserved preferences towards consumption might bias the estimates of the MPC. Second, housing wealth shock is correlated with changes in expected permanent income. So without a very good instrument, the endogeneity of housing wealth, or the changes in housing wealth, could also bias the estimates. Number 3, we need to disentangle the perceived wealth channel from the collateral channel. So here comes my biggest question about the previous literature. So for previous literature empirical findings, they tried to disentangle the two channels by examining, by comparing more borrowing credit constrained households to those less borrowing constrained households. And the measurement they measure the borrowing constraint by using LTVs. So basically they're saying that for those with higher LTVs, they have greater MPCs. But actually there is a loophole here, is to reach that conclusion, you need to assume that it is those highly credit constrained households who are extracting more home equity when they experience a positive shocks in housing wealth. And I think this assumption is untested theoretically. The fourth empirical challenges is we are lack of longitudinal micro-level data with very good quality consumption and wealth information. Because to examine this question, you need both wealth, household level, and consumption household level data together to control for the household level unobserved preferences. And number 5 is we need to distinguish between permanent and transitory perceived housing wealth shocks. As I asked during the survey questions, whether you perceive that 10% increase is permanent or transitory, that may have an impact on your final decision. So the idea in this paper is we try to address these unsolved empirical questions directly by using PSID. So PSID is actually a longitudinal data set with both very good quality wealth and consumption data after 2005. And also, the data structure allows us to control for the household fixed effect to rule out or tease out the unobserved factors that are affecting the household's consumption behaviors. And also we try to decompose the consumption categories to see whether households vary their consumption responses based on the type of the categories or the expenditure categories. Then we used an IV approach to disentangle the transitory housing shocks from the permanent housing shocks. And we conduct a series of robustness check to further convince that we have the right answer. First, we start with the data. The data here is PSID, and it follows the US households since 1968. After 1997, the survey conducts biannually. And before 1999, the consumption data under PSID is not good enough. It only has some food and transportation data. But after 2005, it contains a relative exhaustive consumption data set that is comparable to consumer expenditure survey. And the unit in this analysis is household. The sample period is from 2005 to 2015 to better capture the most recent housing boom and bust period, and also to better utilize the high quality data in both consumption and household wealth. A big question is about the representativeness of PSID. You may argue that you can't just simply improve the previous literature by using a data set and then the problem solved, right? But actually, if you see the literature before 2005, there's not, at micro level, there's not a good data set that can be comparable to the current data structure of PSID. And actually, several papers have already proved the representativeness of PSID in terms of the consumption data to see what to prove that it's comparable to the consumer expenditure survey. For the wealth data part, we do the cross-check with Survey of Consumer Finance to make sure it's comparable. So here is a summary statistics of the consumption and wealth variables. the total consumption is decomposed to food, housing, cloth, health, education, transportation, and recreation. Actually, it lacks a category of childcare because the magnitude is really small, so we exclude that in our regression. If you compare the mean and median values here, you can see that we may have a problem because here the mean is could be driven by some outliers. And also another issue with our sample is we may have a selection bias because here we're only looking at homeowners. So to address those two issues, first, we add the inverse Real-Smith ratios derived from a tenure choice model to address the selection bias caused by only looking at the homeowners. And then to address the outlier issues, besides the baseline model, which is OLS, I will talk about that later, we also ran a median regression to see whether the results differ significantly. And here is a graph illustrating the trend of those subcategories over time. You see that the childcare, the magnitude of the expenditure in childcare is really small, so we exclude these subcategories in the later regressions. And this is the cross-check between PSID and SCF, the Survey of Consumer Finance, in terms of total wealth and housing wealth, because they have different survey years. Here we can see that a blunt comparison, we can see that basically housing wealth and total wealth move parallel. But for some of the years, total wealth under Survey of Consumer Finance, they have greater magnitude. The baseline model here, we start from OLS that is consistent with the previous literature. And then we add state and year fixed effect to the OLS regression, treat that as the baseline model. So here, the dependent variable is the non-housing total consumption. And HW is the housing wealth, FW is the financial wealth, and also household income. The control here, we include head age, race, sex, marital status, employment status, family size, family health status, and whether you move from the previous period. That's the baseline model. And move from the OLS, we go to the fixed effect model where we add a household fixed effect to better control for the unobservables. But here, under fixed effect, we need to disentangle the perceived housing wealth and the collateral channel. Here we use two proxies to achieve that. Measurement one is, since the year 2003, PSID introduced a new question asking households whether your current primary resident loan is a home equity loan or not. So we create a dummy if you answer yes to a home equity loan from the shifting from zero to no to yes, then we assign the value as 1 for that dummy variables. Otherwise, it's 0. That's our measurement, direct measurement on whether you extract your home equity. And measurement 2 is our discussant and her co-authors recently published a paper. They also use PSID, but use another measurement to capture the collateral channel, which is the changes in remaining mortgage principals for just the changes in remaining mortgage principles. But here in our paper, we used a little bit differently because here we're only looking at those non-movers. For those movers, with increasing mortgage principles, we treat the dummy value as 0. So here is a table summarizing the baseline regression model and the fixed effect model. So column 1 is the OLS regression with both year fixed effect and stay fixed effect. Column 2 is the median regression to address the problem caused by the outliers. And column 3 is the fixed effect model. Here we add household fixed effect. So for column 4 and 5, we compare the two measurements on home equity extraction. We can see that with a better control of the unobservables at the household level, the magnitude of housing wealth impact decreased from 0.058 to 0.012 or 0.013. decreased significantly. And actually, the two measurements on home equity extraction does not cause significant changes on the MPC out of housing wealth. It's interesting that financial wealth and family income holds constant over time, so they remain significant under both the OLS regression and fixed effect regression. So here, if you check the red box, the two measurements both gave us significant results, meaning that people choosing to extract their home equity are experiencing increase in non-housing total consumption. But here, the activity where your behavior of choosing to extract your home equity might be endogenous. So to examine whether those high LTV or highly credit constrained households are the ones who actually extract home equity, we further conduct a logit model. Here, the dependent variable is a dummy, indicating whether or not you extract your home equity. So for column 1 and 2, we use the measurement number 1, which is your self-reported change of your mortgage type. And for column 3 and 4, we replicate the Lingxiao's paper using your mortgage debt increase. And it's interesting here to see that if we compare column 1 and 3, which indicate homeowners are more likely to extract their home equity when their housing wealth has increased. But then if we combine column 2 and 4, we can see that those with higher LTV are less likely to extract home equity. And then the interaction terms here gives us a negative sign, which means when housing wealth increases, those with higher LTV are less likely to extract home equity. That is actually contrary to the previous literature, where the previous approach to disentangle the pure wealth effect and collateral channel. So actually here the loophole is not filled, because those with highly credit constraints are not the ones who choose to extract their home equity when experiencing increase in housing wealth. Our explanation is because you're already highly in debt, the default risk will even increase further if you choose to tap on your home equity further. So people may not tend to choose that option. So we can see that use the level of borrowing constraint to separate the two channels can lead to inaccurate estimates. Then we further decompose the impact on those subcategories. It's interesting to see that only for clothes and recreation, those one-time or auxiliary subcategories, does housing wealth impact have significant impact, whereas financial wealth and family income stay constant over time. To make sure our results are robust, we try to examine the heterogeneity across different factors. First, because here, even if under fixed effect, we are better controlling for the unobserved factors at the household level, our results may still be biased due to the failure of controlling the expected income. So following Cooper's paper in 2013, we used a head 2-year income growth rate as a proxy to measure the household's expected income, or their expectations. And it turns out we have consistent results as Cooper's paper. The housing wealth effect does not change significantly with the introduction of the expected income. And later we compare whether age plays a factor here. We further truncate our sample into working age group, which is age between 25 to 65. And we see that the magnitude increased a little bit from 0.012 to 0.016. And then we try to see if there's a symmetric effect, which means like pre and post differential impact on household consumption. But as I said, before 2005, the consumption data in PICID is not as good as the post 2005 period. So we just extract the overlapping components under the consumption category and do the comparison. But here you can see that for both pre and post crisis, the coefficients are insignificant. Here we cannot reject that there's a symmetric effect. And for the last two columns, we try to correct the measurement error caused by the self-reported housing values. We use the geocoded information in PSID to replace the self-reported house values with the zip code level HPI provided by FHFA. And when we change that values, replace that values, here the significance goes away. But there's empirical literature indicating that households may have greater incentive to overestimate their house values in terms of self-reported questions. So here it's uncertain which measure is actually a better one. So now let's go back to the starting point. We have those three hypotheses, and we have those empirical changes. With a fixed effect at the household level, I think we address the first one and observe preferences towards consumption. And with the direct measurement of the collateral channel, I think we address the third one, which is we are able to disentangle perceived wealth channel from collateral channel. And we prove that it is not those borrower-constrained households who are more likely to extract their home equity. But the remaining questions are number 2 and number 5. So using Cooper's proxy, which is the 2-year ahead income growth, is not it's not a perfect measurement on your expectation of your future income. And also, we haven't distinguished between permanent and transitory perceived housing wealth shocks yet. So here is whether the fixed effect with control for expected income growth, this 0.13, is that actually capturing the perceived housing wealth channel. Here we have statistical significance, but does it mean we have an economic significance? So the next question is this effect the result of permanent or transitory wealth shock? To answer this question, we employ an IV approach, try to disentangle the two. The instrument here is a quality-adjusted house price, trying to capture the fundamental value changes over 2005 to 2016. The mechanism is pretty straightforward, because here the goal is to distinguish the permanent and transitory shocks, which means we need instruments to better capture the fundamental value changes over time. So following the previous paper, we did the regression, hedonic regression, which include structural characteristics, neighborhood characteristics, geographical factors, and also contract characteristics to model the house prices over time for 348 MSAs over the past 12 years. And for each regression, the hedonic coefficient captured the implicit marginal prices for the hedonic attributes. And then with the 348 times 12 regressions, we take the grand means of all the hedonic variables across MSAs over time, try to capture a nationally representative housing unit, and then use that grand mean to multiply with the estimate coefficients for each MSA at each year. So here's the results for Los Angeles. If we compare the constructed HPI, which is the gray line, and also the FHFA indices, we see there's some differences. So the constructed adjusted constructed HPI is a bit higher before 2013, and then a bit lower after that. This table compares the quality adjusted hedonic HPI and also the FHA HPI in terms of the magnitude. If we're only focusing on the bottom one, we see that almost half of the MSAs in the United States are having the constructed HPI are having lower magnitude than the FHFA HPI. And this table shows the top 10 and lower 10 MSAs who share the greatest volatility between the two. If you check the Lusk column, which is the average, we can see that the difference between the constructed HPI, which captures the fundamental value changes over time, could be as small as half of the FHFA HPI, or as big as almost 1.6 times the FHFA HPI. And then we use this quality adjusted HPI to instrument for the changes in housing wealth. And this table shows the IV results. It's interesting to see that under column 3, the significance goes away with the instrument. But for financial wealth and family income, the impact stays constant. So here we have two stories. Story number 1. To interpret this table. Story number 1 is, in the short run, that it is the expectations that matter here. For example, during the survey question, when I ask you, there is a 10% increase in your house prices. As a homeowner, normally there's no way for you to rationally identify what is the real house price appreciation rates in your neighborhood. So it's actually your expectations drive the difference here, drives the deviation of your perceived expected house price growth rates from the fundamental house price appreciation rates. And the difference slightly drives the consumption in those subcategories such as clothing and recreation. But in the long run, that slightly positive MPC will move towards to 0 as households' expectations converge with the true house values. But that's just story 1. Another way to interpret the results of the non-significant housing wealth impact is, we can treat this quality adjusted HPI as a better instrument than what Cooper used in his paper, which is with this quality adjusted house price, it better captures or controls for the transitory local economic shocks. And that is a better instrument than your self-calculated 2 years ahead income growth. So if you buy it, that this is a more valid IV, then the result is actually there's no pure housing wealth effect. If you choose to go with the expectation theory, then actually that 0.012 might indicating a small magnitude of housing wealth effect. So here we really welcome your comments and questions regarding which story should we go in the next step to interpret the results. Thank you.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here today to discuss this paper, very interesting and different findings from previous studies. I'm Lingxiao from Fullerton. So as a summary for this study investigates marginal propensity to consume out of housing consumption using PSID data, which include detailed information about consumption, wealth, property value, and mortgage. The author tried to control unobserved household preference towards consumption using the household fixed effect and their future expected income with a 2-year income growth rate, which cannot be done at aggregate data level. And also they try to disentangle the pure wealth effect from the collateral channel using home equity extraction as one of the control in their paper. So I find the most interesting part is the result shows it's a deviation between the perceived house value appreciation and the real price appreciation drive the small marginal propensity of consumption out of the house wealth in the short run, which will disappear in the long run. Actually, that is the finding. We never see it before. And also, every time when we talk about true property value, fundamental bubbles that always catch the eyes, how do we estimate it? So we observe this co-movement between property price and household consumption. And why and how does household consumption being affected by the property price? So there are 2 channels, as the author has mentioned, conventional wealth channel and collateral channel. So the conventional wealth channel, households feel wealthier if there is a price appreciation on their property. Consequently, they spend more on consumption in general. It's for the household, not economists in this room. And the second collateral effect is the property value increase, which enabled the household to borrow more money against the home equity and stimulate the consumption. So the empirical findings regarding the house wealth effect on consumption spending vary significantly from virtually no effect to very large effect. Study has been done at both aggregate level and micro levels. In general, a lot of studies find a positive relation between household consumption and property wealth. And at the micro level data, the Browning et al. 2013 paper, they used a Danish data set about household consumption and property value. That's only micro level data set, but didn't find any significant relation between household value and consumption. And our paper 2019, we also use this PSID data set. And what we look at is how does this household respond differently to the different type of home equity, the extractable home equity, the option to retrieve wealth, and extracted home equity, the ability to exercise this option. How does that vary? And we do find a significant impact of house wealth on the consumption. So the major challenge to understand the impact of house and wealth on consumption is that these two variables are strongly correlated with other unobservables, including financial wealth and human capital, so make it more difficult to infer any causal relations. So this is a quote about 20 years ago from Greenspan at the Mortgage Bank Association. 20 years later, we are still working on this problem. So one might expect a significant portion of the unencumbered cash received by the sellers and refinancers was used to purchase goods and service. However, in the models of consumer spending, we have not been able to find much incremental explanatory power of such extraction. Perhaps this is because the seller's extraction is sufficiently correlated with other variables in the model, such as stock market wealth, and that model had difficulty disentangling these influences. So this paper is really trying to do a lot of job to address those issues and difficulty. So with rich information at household level data in the PSID, the author uses household preference, address unobserved household preference, use a fixed effect, and expected income. That's great. They try to address some variables which had not been addressed with the data previously. And also with the mortgage information at PSID, they use the home equity extraction to control for the collateral channel. So that is the realized money, realized home equity extraction that's increase in the mortgage indebtedness, which I extract like more money from my property when the property price appreciate, and I can use this money to purchase a new car or increase my consumption. And next part, and also some part I have the question about, the quality-adjusted local hedonic price indices is employed to instrument for the permanent change, the fundamental value for each property, in contrast to the self-reported house value in the PSID. So there have been previous studies, and Gary's paper in 2018, and other studies found there are significant gaps between homeowners' self-reported home value and market estimate. And the gaps really vary depending on the market conditions and the property types. So first question, what is the definition for house wealth in this paper? Is it self-reported house value, or is it the net home equity, which is the house value, self-reported here, subtract mortgage balance? I think it helps the readers to understand better about this paper by have one sentence or two just describe how do we define the housing wealth here. And also we try to address unobserved variables, but endogeneity can also arise between the housing price and the wealth consumption from other common macroeconomic shocks. And financial planning, we could think about interest rate may affect both price and consumption, and the local state-level credit supply may affect the house price and consumption, and also home affordability. So those are the variables which we could try to address possibly in the future version of this paper, and all of these variables I try to make it available here. So all of these variables are available. So the state level refinance loan deny ratio and the refinance loan amount is available at home data set. And home affordability indices at metropolitan area quarterly available at the FHFA's website. And if we think about a household consumption decision. We want to try to maximize our utility from consumption given our budget constraint. So our wealth equals to the financial wealth and household wealth, our income. So the sensitivity between the consumption and household wealth really depends on how much I'm willing to get cash out of the house and how easy it is for me to get cash out of the house. So the cash equivalent coefficient for the stock holding and home equity really matters. So assuming we have this cash equivalent coefficient in number between 0 and 1, so a higher cash equivalent coefficient for housing asset just implies household will perceive a higher level of cash equivalent wealth from her home equity due to its convertibility to cash. And so the sensitivity really matters. If the market liquidity increase, it will be easier for us to convert home equity into cash. So we will perceive higher level of wealth or a higher sensitivity between consumption and property value. So here again, we can try to address this market liquidity by looking at credit supply or define the property into different subsample periods like hot market, cold market. And the sensitivity between consumption and house wealth also varies with two groups of different type of borrowers. So here the author tries to address the financially constraint, whether you are able to borrow or not. But let's take a look at the liquidity constraint. What is the need for me to borrow against my property? And also, how for this liquidity constraint, liquidity unconstrained group, how is their response to different type of house wealth, perceived house wealth and extracted house wealth? If you think about liquidity constrained household, they may have limited access to the uncollateralized borrowing, so they often have to tap into their home equity, which is extracted home equity, when they want to increase their consumption. But for the liquidity unconstrained household, the house may affect their consumption mainly through the housing wealth effect, because apart from the security loans like home equity loans, they can draw on more the liquidity asset or uncollateralized borrowings like credit cards for consumption. So it's worthwhile for the author to explore the different variations. With the PSID data, it is possible to distinguish liquidity constraint with the total wealth, proportion of liquidity wealth out of the total wealth, debt to income ratio, and loan to value ratio. And as I said, if it is a transitional deviation from the property value rather than permanent one that drive this marginal propensity to consumption, so how do we construct a quality adjusted house value with self-reported property value? There is a problem, it's biased, but we do have private information. But what is the real value for any property? So the author used this Symposium 1998 paper and the Linna Zhu 2018 paper, where they try to estimate the true value for the property with structure characteristics, neighborhood characteristics, geographic characteristics, and contract characteristics. I understand better after the presentation for this part. So the author tried to use like the mean, the average representative property in the neighborhood to give the true quality adjusted property value. So they have this restricted geo-coded PSID data. The general PSID data just have state identification for the household. But I go to PSID website, read the description. The restricted PSID geo-coded data could go to at census level. So it's possible for you to match this data with census tracked variables. But how can we match it with a transaction data? Do we have identical property address, which we will be able to say exactly what are the property level structure characteristics for this property, so we would be able to apply the coefficient implicit price for each of the attributes to get a real property price. So that is a problem. Is the average representative property a good representative for a specific property in this neighborhood? And this is some minor things. It's on page 11. The author said as the PSID data they provide for consumption data from 2005. We cannot use this data to compare the house and wealth coefficient for the pre-post crisis analysis. So to address this issue, we use a subset for the consumption data, which is obtained from 1999. And this consumption subset variable exclude X and Y. And in the table, what we find is pre-post crisis analysis, house and wealth is not significant. It's different from the baseline effect. We find significant result. So based on my reading about this paper, X and Y are defined on page 8, where X is a vector of demographic controls and Y is household income. So even before 2005, we don't have really this great information about detailed category of consumptions. We do have some major consumption variables like food, transportations. It is still possible for us to try to conduct this pre-post crisis analysis. If we drop, my understanding is right, this X and Y variables, the result will for sure be different from the baseline model after 2005 to 2015. So that's my discussion. It's a great paper. I really enjoy reading it, and I'm looking forward for the next version of the paper. Thank you.